Hello and welcome to the Questioning Behaviour podcast. We are your hosts, Sarah, and I'm here with Merle.
Hello.
And we're here to talk about some interesting topics through a behavioural science lens.
You're the dummy that don't believe in science. All your projects always be denying. You're the dummy that
And today on this episode, we're actually going to be diving a little bit deeper into the behavioural science of happiness and well-being and what that means. You know, how is it that we can start to prioritize people's happiness? It's an interesting question. It's a question that I don't think that the world at the moment is necessarily providing the best answers to. So it's important to discuss it a bit more in detail, I think. So, I mean, my first question for you, Mala, is what makes you happy?
What makes me happy? I mean, that's always a very good question. I think so. I mean, from an economics type perspective, I know there was this question like how much money will make you happy. To that, I haven't found a question, but like if I'm able to pay my bills and set some money aside, I'm quite pleased. If I can save up for a holiday and it doesn't take too long, I'm quite pleased. I think quite pleased will equate to happiness, I suppose. If I get to spend some time working, I'm quite happy. But then when I say sometime, I mean like a nice work-life balance. That makes me happy.
Yeah,
Spending
balance.
time with friends and family makes me happy. I like to exercise and stay in shape. That makes me happy. I think when because I go running a lot, I know it's not exactly great for your knees, but it kind of distresses me. So I think a lack of stress makes me happy. And then I suppose good health makes me happy. Although I'm currently suffering allergies, so it's good health. But then I guess there's people a lot worse off in the world, health wise or finance wise. So I feel like I'm quite good. So all these things make me happy, and then sometimes I like to spend some money, go shopping, watch a nice movie, spend my time without too many constraints, and all of that makes me happy. I'm quite a happy person, I feel like.
It's interesting that there are so many things that you can think of just off the top of your head that contribute to your happiness.
Yes,
it's
but
multifaceted.
No, it's just because I've noticed that if I go without one of those for a long time, I become insufferable as a person. Which is, I suppose my environment notices more than I do. But yeah, what makes you happy then? Do you also have such a long list?
Well, I think if we're thinking about it from a perspective of what helps me avoid being miserable and actually makes me a nice person to be around, then there are two things. Well, three things actually, and that's sleep, eating at regular intervals, and exercising.
You're such a simple person, Sarah. That's lovely.
Well, I'm just thinking at the very core level, like if I miss a meal, my stomach physically hurts and I'm super irritable. The same thing if I only get like 4 hours sleeps. For some people, that's enough. For me, my whole equilibrium is just off. Like everything I then view through the world is like slightly grey tinged, and
everything sucks. You suck. Your mom sucks. The world is going to shit. Just eat a Snickers and sleep an additional 3 hours. That's all good.
I feel like that's often the root of many of my problems.
So as like a coping mechanism, like meditation and like these mindfulness things, like are they useful to you? Do they make you feel better, happier, anything?
To be honest, it's never really appealed to me. I'm interested in having sort of a theory of mind and sort of examining and re-examining, my assumptions and biases about how my brain actually works and how much control I have over the thoughts and things that come into my mind. I like thinking about that, but I do not at all really take time out of my day, particularly to practice mindfulness. What even is mindfulness? Is it just thinking? Like
I don't know. I have tried mindfulness multiple times on the advice of others, and I've done it through YouTube, and I've done it with like a person who was like trained in it, and I hate it. So it's a combination of probably me not doing it right and me not being a type of person to work well with mindfulness. To move on to our guest of today, we are talking to Paul Dolan, Professor Paul Dolan, excuse me. He is professor and I'm pretty sure the coordinator of the LSE course in behavioral economics. His main field of study, or his main topic of study, is happiness, and he's published a lot of work in it. So I feel like he ought to know what's up. So yeah, time to talk to Paul. Okay, and today we have the amazing Paul Dolan on the podcast. So, as is key with this podcast, we let our guests introduce themselves. So, Paul, please tell the audience, who are you?
I am Paul Dolan, and I am Professor of Behavioural Science at the London School of Economics.
All right, short but sweet. Fair enough. And how exactly did you get into behavioral science? What made you dive into the field?
Oh, I don't know what made me. I guess randomness and luck plays a big part in a lot of what we do. In fact, most of what we do, in fact. So these things happen by chance. I trained as a health economist originally. Well, maybe I can expand a little bit more on the randomness of it. I was very interested in measuring health outcomes, measuring anything that actually isn't bought and sold in markets, right? So how we value intangible goods, how we value health improvements, how we value clean air, how we value parks, and things that we don't directly buy and sell. So I've always been interested in that, and I did a lot of work, as I say, in valuing health, and then I actually won a prize for my contribution to health economics, which brought me out of some teaching for a bit, and gave me some money to go off and do things. And I noticed there was an economics of happiness conference on in Milan, so I thought, well, that sounds quite cool, happiness in Milan. So I went over to the conference, and that was where I met Kahneman, and we started chatting, and he said that I could go across to Princeton, which I did for a bit, and so I got more interested in directly assessing the impact of not just health conditions, but all the things that life throws at us, and all the things that we do on how they make us feel.
Fair enough.
So you reckon that happiness is pretty much, is it at the center of what behavioral science should be doing, or is there not enough emphasis on happiness at the moment, do you think?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So sort of you could see there was two different areas. So I guess the happiness economics area is typically using existing data, large data sets, to try to extract causal inference from data that isn't causal, and looking at how different factors of someone's life affect their happiness, and also how happiness affects those factors too. And then on the other hand, you've got behavioral science research, which is doing lab experiments, field experiments, very concerned with causal inference, randomized controlled trials to establish the causal effects of a particular behavioral intervention, but without much regard for whether that actually makes people feel better or not.
Right.
And so it's partly the methods that are used in those different areas are different. Of course, this is a huge generalization of what's being done, but those two worlds haven't spoken to one another very much, really, and there needs to be much more communication, because, of course, what we do affects how we feel affects what we do. There's a dynamic relationship between behaviour and well-being, and I suppose personally, I'm very interested in understanding whether the things that we think are good for people, when we nudge and shove them in certain directions, whether they actually show up as being substantively good for people as they report them, as they live and breathe their lives.
So how would we better test for this? Because it seems like there's still a lot of work to be done to actually get somewhere productive.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably putting measures of well-being into some of the randomized controlled trials that are done in the behavioral interventions. There's nothing stopping us asking people how they feel, and maybe actually there's more modern technological ways in which we could do that by gathering passive data on people to make inferences about their well-being. And I guess that's really, I want to try to get happiness into the causal world in the way that we've done it with nudging behaviours. And changing behaviours, because so much, I mean, I do this as well. We all do. We loosely fall into saying, this affects happiness and this doesn't and whatever else. But actually, most of the data that we've got to say that aren't causal. We don't really have genuine differences across people that we're able to predict, because, of course, people's tastes vary. And actually really understanding the preference heterogeneity is important for behavioural science. We really need to understand whether and in what way people differ. And it's really also important, of course, for how we understand the causal effects of interventions on people's happiness and how happiness affects what people do, because we need to understand much more about what makes people different as well as what makes them similar.
Very wise.
Fair enough. Would you say there is too much of an emphasis on weird samples, so Western, highly educated type samples? We know this is the case for behavioral economics or behavioral science as a general field. Is this also an issue within happiness studies specifically?
Well, it's certainly a case in lab studies. I mean, of course, the field experiments do try to, have much wider populations. I mean, as I say, the happiness data doesn't suffer from that problem, because it's generally, like there's large scale longitudinal data sets, panel data sets, household data sets. There will be a selection effect into the studies, right? I mean, people are not. You have to wonder about the kinds of people that aren't in the studies, not only the selection of particular people, but also of different population groups, right? So we have very few homeless people, for example. We don't know very much about the well-being of homeless people because they're not in our household panel household surveys. So arguably some of the most important population policy purposes are missing from some of these data, but we do have lots of data on lots of people. The challenge, as I say, is making causal inference about which things affect well-being in particular ways.
So far, what do we know about what affects happiness, albeit in a correlational sense?
Well, I do think the answer to that question actually depends on how we define happiness, right? Because the different ways in which that's defined will lead us to different conclusions about the things that affect it. Okay. I've made what I would consider to be a pretty compelling case for focusing more directly on people's experiences. So happiness by design, the subtitle is Finding Pleasure and Purpose in Everyday Life. It's about, for me, sort of understanding how people use their time, what they pay attention to as they go about their lives, and having a twin set of objectives in mind, being happy according to experiencing pleasure, but also purpose, to the sense that we find some things not just fun, but also fulfilling. And that's located in what we do. And so therefore, if you adopt that perspective on happiness, time use becomes critical.
Right.
Actually, more importantly, what we pay attention to when we're using our time in a way. So, and if you think about scarcity, which is the core principle of economics, really, I mean, that's what economics is. It's the allocation of scarce resources. The scarcest resource we've all got is our time. I mean, we can beg, borrow, and steal money, but we can't get time back that's lost. So it becomes, I think, really important that we think about how we use our time to best effect. So when we have happiness defined as the flow of experiences over time, then our time use becomes critical. So we ought to be thinking much more about how we allocate our scarce 24. There's only 24 hours in a day. There's only 7 days in a week, and so on. That we're thinking a bit more than we perhaps do at the moment about how we allocate that scarce resource.
And at the moment, I guess you could argue that happiness isn't necessarily the main objective of researchers or policymakers. Even when we think about what policies are put into play in government. But what happens, or what do you think would happen if tomorrow we woke up and actually improving happiness was the main objective of governments all over the world? What would be different about that world?
Yeah, I mean it's interesting. If you reframe that question to the reduction of misery as opposed to the promotion of happiness, you get a very different frame of reference, don't you? It's like policymakers are not interested in reducing misery. policymakers are not interested in minimizing suffering. I mean, that would be pathological, wouldn't it? But somehow maximizing happiness has a different connotation, and so we might want to recast some of that conversation to actually focus more directly on misery and suffering. And then I do think, again, I think it's fundamentally important that we pay attention to the experiences of people that suffer, not just what we think they ought to be suffering about.
Okay,
right.
But actually what things really do affect them, what things do they pay attention to in ways that make them miserable. I mean, that's, or anxious or depressed, and that kind of leads into the answer really being around mental health, doesn't it? I mean, it sort of helps us, I think, more directly focus on the conditions and circumstances of people's lives and the way in which they use their time that affect them in ways that affect their mental health in an adverse way. So I think that would be the fundamental difference, is that we would recast the policy lens through the reduction of misery with an emphasis on mental health conditions. I mean, it's scandalous that in the UK we talk about this all the time. It comes up all the time about how mental health is now a priority. We've learned lessons and more, but still, if you have an eating disorder, for example, which is a mental health condition, which I think has the highest mortality rate associated with it, I think, or at least one of the.
I would argue it's top 5 at least.
Yeah, I think it's certainly right up there. But you would, even whether it does or not, it still causes misery in the experience. So the fact that you would have to wait months in order to get effective interventions, and in fact you'd have to actually almost actively make yourself sicker in order to access service. I mean, we would never do that for a physical health problem. Go away, get yourself even more physically ill.
Yeah, break your leg even further.
Break your leg even further. Experience a bit more pain even further before we consider treating you. I mean, it's completely perverse. So I think that's the short answer, is that we would pay much more attention to mental health conditions.
All right. So you said that the reduction of misery through policy would be almost pathological. What exactly did you mean by that?
Well, I mean, not to be concerned with reducing misery.
I see. Gotcha.
Would be pathological. As a policymaker, I'm not interested in reducing misery. I mean, that would be that makes you sound. That would make you a masochistic policymaker. But if you say I'm not interested in maximising happiness, that somehow doesn't sound quite so masochistic. And so I think that's why, for policy purposes, we might want to recast some of that conversation, because we do care. We ought to care. A civilized society cares about those that suffer most, and so we need much more identification of those that suffer by how they report their lives, and not by how we would judge them.
All right. So, do you think we're a very civilized society then, or are we lacking a bit?
Well, I guess it depends whether you see the glass as half empty or half full. I guess there's always more. We're civilized in so many ways, but there's always more that we could do. And I think that I talk a bit more about the perspectives in Happy Ever After, my second book. But the idea that we judge the conditions of people's lives according to the rules that we think they ought to live by, or the rules that we think we ought to live by. And I think that's one of the biggest hurdles to being more civilized, is for us to kind of be a little bit less prescriptive about the lives that we ought to lead, and particularly the lives that others ought to lead. Because it's fascinated me for a very long time how disproportionately affected we are by what we do. We should, sort of. And that sort of plays through a lot in policy as well, I think. We try to kind of nudge and shove people in directions that actually they really genuinely might not be better off doing. And that requires us to have recourse to those effects, but also to be, I think, more diverse in our discipline. And I mean diversity by characteristics of the ones that we do quite rightly pay attention to, gender and race and sexual orientation and so on, but also by diversity of thought, by people having different opinions and different beliefs. And I'm particularly interested in the role that social class plays in that. For example, how I mean, if you think about, you can think about a lot of behavioural interventions as really, particularly I think in health and finance, as being designed to kind of essentially nudge people to become more middle class. I mean, that's really what a lot of those interventions are. And actually, sometimes that might be good for people. But I kind of like to have a fuller and richer conversation about whether and under what conditions that's true, and to be much more inclusive of a diverse set of opinions and beliefs in the design of the interventions and also in the assessment of their impact.
I think that's really fascinating. So, I mean, part of, I guess, the solution of incorporating happiness and well-being concerns into current and future research is building in these wellness and well-being measures. So what would you say to people who say, happiness is a construct that can't be measured and compared across, countries and communities?
I suppose there's two things. One is whether the data that are available allow us to make those comparisons. And the second is the deeper conceptual question about whether in principle it's possible. So I mean, I think the second question is much more up for grabs in a sense. I mean, I think some of the international comparisons of life satisfaction reports might be problematic because you've got, different people ask different questions that are translated in different ways across different nations at different times. And so, that does make comparison more difficult. So, we know that asking people questions on the phone compared to face or over the internet, you get different answers. So, if you've got different countries have different ways of sampling, for example, then you're going to have different responses that might be explained to some degree by the different modes of administration. So that's important. We need to be alert to that. The substance of whether you can make the comparisons, I've always found that a little bit odd, because one of the criticisms of happiness research is that it's all subjective. Something like that. Well, that's the whole point. I mean, life is a subjective experience. It's like when I think about, when I've got a few tattoos and people might ask, did they hurt? And I'm like, yes. Well, I have no idea whether it's going to hurt you or not. I mean, people report, and you speak to a tattoo, they'll tell you someone have the same tattoo in the same spot, and one person will find that fine, and the other person will be screaming in agony. And the objective condition of the tattoo is the same, but the subjective experience of the pain is different. And it seems to me that that's what ultimately matters, is the subjective interpretation of our world, and not only or even the objective conditions.
Now, the interesting thing is with pain, because there's been a lot of neuroscientific or neuroeconomic research on it, that even although this experience is very, very subjective, it is to some extent objectifiable if I jam you into an fMRI scanner, although I wouldn't recommend getting tattooed in an fMRI scanner.
No.
No, it's probably not ideal. But would you argue that this is equally possible for happiness? Because happiness to me seems much more complex than something as simple as pain.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think there's huge advances that we've made in understanding behaviour and well-being, and particularly some of the system 1, system 2 interactions and stuff through neuroscientific evidence, and so that's hugely beneficial. But there is something, I don't know if you've ever been in a scanner, but of course it's not that you have to keep perfectly still. Really fucking noisy as well.
Yes.
I was really surprised at how noisy. It's like an industrial site going on around your head. Well, it wouldn't be surprising if the brain reacted differently to conditions where it's perfectly still and there's lots of noise.
True.
So especially as we have embodied cognition, I'm moving my hands now for emphasis as I speak. Of course, you can't do it, and almost certainly my neural networks are different as a result of the expression of movement. So I think those tightly controlled conditions of a scanner provide enormous insight, but will of course be limited.
Sure, that's fair. That's fair.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of that in that way, so that's really interesting. This may be a bit of a departure from, I guess, the seriousness of our conversation so far, but you are known yourself for being a lover of fitness. I think we've even heard you referred to as the bodybuilder academic. I'm not sure if that's a moniker that you use yourself. I don't know if you coined that.
Certainly not mine. There are a few. I know it's always hard to. Yeah, no, I should realise that sometimes when other people say these things, that people are going to think that you said it about yourself. No, I don't. I certainly didn't say. I'm sure there are other things that I've said about myself that would make me cringe, but I didn't say that.
Okay. So you are known as.
It is true, but it is still true.
Okay, so I guess the question is, what is the role of exercise in happiness? I guess in your personal life or in general, what does the research say about exercise and happiness?
Yeah, so first of all, I think it's important to draw attention to that individual heterogeneity, right? So, and I think that's the problem that a lot of people suffer from, is that they, like, I go to the gym, I like lifting weights, I like chucking weights around. I've done it for a very, very, very long time. I can't at the moment, actually. It's the first time in 20 years I've not been able to go to the gym. Yeah, it isn't the same doing it out in the garden, actually, I've realised. There's something about the separation, which is a different point to the exercise, I think, about, it's almost like I realise, well, I kind of knew this before anyway, but it's reaffirmed this kind of mindfulness that I have from going to the gym. It's like being in the gym for 45 minutes or whatever that I'm in there lifting the weights. I'm not checking my phone. It's a mindful activity. I'm far too hyperactive to do mindfulness, right? To sit still for God knows how long and not talk or whatever, and not move around. So, the gym is my mindfulness, and doing it in the garden gives me the physical activity, but it doesn't give me the mental escape in the same way because it's too proximate. So I think that the important point is that there will be differences across individuals. That I love it, and I think therefore you must be mad if you don't. But that's completely silly, and that's what happens with mindfulness. People like mindfulness is like, if only you learn to sit still, you'd love it. Well, I don't want to learn to sit still. Oh, good.
No, I hate it. I absolutely hate mindfulness because I have thoughts that race at about 160 kilometers per hour, and mindfulness just doesn't work for it. I just sit still and I get anxious, and I don't think panic attacks is what mindfulness is about.
Good. It's nice to see. It's nice that there's some other people out there like me. So it's finding what works for you. I mean, exercise is good. Exercise is good for us, but it has to be something that you enjoy doing, and that's where I come to this happiness again. I mean, you need to. So whilst the behavioural sciences teach us that a lot of what we do, we're kind of misguided or mistaken, and we use biases, heuristics, and all this stuff, and it's kind of nice to show how stupid people are. We're not actually that stupid. I mean, we don't continue with something that we don't enjoy.
Sure.
And we don't, we actually do continue with things that we like. So the framing of these interventions is really important, as well as understanding the substance of them. So you're just not going to stick at something if you don't like it. So let's nudge people into things that they're going to like and stick at. So of course it can take a little while to build up a habit and to enjoy it, but so I think exercise is good. One of the things that we are pretty much alike in relation to is being outdoors. I've actually been quite struck as someone who's born in the East End, loves being in a city that doesn't really get the countryside very much. I do kind of recognise though that it's nice being outdoors amongst greenery, and I think that biophilia is actually probably good for all of us in ways that we might not predict.
Fair enough.
So I think there are things that we can do that would make us better off in ways, in ways sometimes that we might not be able to.
I find it interesting that your happiness comes from going to a gym, but then on lifting weights, and then also being outside in greenery. But the combination of the two, like the greenery and the lifting weights, does nothing for you. Interesting.
No, it's true, isn't it? You want to keep those things separate. No, I'm sure a lot of people have enjoyed exercising outdoors during the current situation, but it's just finding out. I think it's finding out what works for you, and to sort of, I suppose, recognise that a big part of the human condition is to be lazy. I mean, we are just kind of inherently lazy. I mean, we've sort of evolved to conserve resources, not to expend them. So I guess the recognition of our flawed, lazy, characters, I think is actually really important. To then sort of being then able to maybe embed some changes with a with a better understanding of the expectations that we might have about ourselves.
All right. Well, I'm glad I can be happy and lazy at the same time. That really just gives me new hope. It's good for me.
Yeah, and I really don't like bringing up the big corona in the room shaped elephant, but I guess it's something quite topical. I mean, we've spoken to a couple of other people who've said a couple of words on this, but actually, at the moment, the government is really sort of focusing on the economic costs of lockdown, and there's less so really being said about, mental health. It is in conversation, but it's not the priority. So, I mean, what do you think should be more of the government's priority during and coming out of lockdown? If we're thinking about, trying to minimize misery or maximize happiness.
It's a really good question. I mean, I think so. Maybe touch on a couple of things I've said already. Is the diversity of opinion and belief and thought in the decision-making process. I think that we've had, it started out as a health pandemic. So you have health experts, you have epidemiologists, you have virus control experts. But very quickly, it's not just the health pandemic, it's an economic and social pandemic. And so when you're following the science, you should also be following the social science. I mean, that's absolutely fundamental, that the science includes social science. And that includes economics. It includes a consideration of the trade-offs and opportunity costs that are being made. And that's what an economist is trained in thinking about. There are no economists on stage, I think, as far as I'm aware. I mean, there's a question mark about whether the organisations making the decisions, or at least influencing the decisions or making the recommendations, are fit for the purposes, ultimately, of the judgments that are being made, about whether to enter into lockdown, for example, and for how long to stay in it. And I think you're right about the sort of immediate social costs and impact being sort of falling between the cracks. I mean, I think there's something broken when we can't get our school kids back to school. I mean, I think we talk a lot about the data on mortality risks and some of these other consequences that have been very salient and very much at the forefront of our minds. And we know that there are 700,000 children at home who are having a really, really bad experience right now. Their life experiences, as we've paid attention to life expectancy, their life experiences are being harmed for a very long time, maybe their entire lifetime, by not having access to school, where it's the place that they're given attention in a good way. They're listened to. They're fed in some instances, and I think I'm not sure that those opinions have been heard and those thoughts have been heard very loudly in the decision making process. And I think what COVID-19 has done for me is kind of reminded me even that just how important diversity of perspective is in the groups that are making decisions on our behalf. I think I think had there been more vocal educationalists, for example, around the table, the schools might not have even shut in the first place. I mean, I think that that's really, I think lessons are always learned. We always say this after any event or any crisis. I think that the response to a pandemic is a health, economic, and social response, and the appropriate representation of all of those disciplines and expertise more fully as we move forward.
You have already mentioned that, obviously hindsight is 2020, but we always have a lovely question in this podcast where we ask you to do some predicting, if you don't mind. What do you think the future of the behavioral science of happiness is? Where do you think the field is moving towards?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm optimistic that we can start embedding that there'll be. Say more people like me sounds a bit grand and arrogant, doesn't it? But more people who are thinking about the well-being consequences of behavioural interventions. I think, and there are people doing that, and of course, Cass and other people have started talking about these things in various ways, and a few studies that have done this. So I'm not alone in thinking this, but I just want to be. It sort of speaks to this perspective of judgment piece. I just am very, I suppose, increasingly sensitive, I suppose, to judgments being made about other people's behaviours, lives, without proper inquiry into the substance of those people's lives, and in particular into the well-being causes and consequences of their actions. So I think, and I'm optimistic that we might have technologies that can start doing some of this. Right? I've kind of long said that it'd be lovely to find out how happy someone is without asking them, and I think, you know, passive data collection through mobile phone apps and so on might start allowing us to make some inferences. But I suppose fundamentally, it sort of relates to the COVID answer and to previous bits of this conversation, is that I think it's really important that we have the diversity of perspective in the design and the implementation and the evaluation of behavioural interventions. And that's diversity according to the traditional characteristics that we might measure them by, but also by people's beliefs and thoughts. I think I wouldn't like to think that behavioural science becomes a kind of silo of activity where the people working in it are all very similar and sort of nod in agreement with one another. And so I think one of the things Kahneman and others have spoken about in the past is adversarial collaboration. I think that's actually going to be really important. I think we should actively be designing behavioural science interventions and insights where people go into that disagreeing, and you flush out the adversarial nature of the collaboration that we have. That you and I have very different views about this, whatever this is, and come together in the interest of science to test our different beliefs and hypotheses very openly and very candidly, rather than instead believing that we're all independent and neutral scientists, because we're not. We all come with our own baggage, we all come with our own prejudices, we all come with our own biases. And so I think maybe that's, in a roundabout way, I think I've answered that question better than I've which is that we flush out an adversarial collaborative approach.
All right, I love it. So this is good for me and Sarah because we're both contrarians. So this is gonna, we can reap the benefits out of this one. Then moving towards, this type of collaboration, so adversarial collaboration, would you say that is the key message of this episode? Is that the one thing that you would like listeners to take away from this episode?
One thing? Why they got to take it one?
Short attention span, man. It is what it is.
Harsh, isn't it? They can take away what they want. They can take away nothing if they want to.
All right. I guess this was too prescriptive. I'm sorry for asking.
There you go, Steve. Doing it again.
But it was amazing to speak with you, Paul. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Oh, thank you so much for asking me. Thank you so much. It's been fun.
Just if you want to plug anything that you're doing right now or any social media.
Well, did you see how naturally I plugged both
very
books?
Nicely done.
Do you see how they both were there? So obviously they've been plugged. So we should do have you got a hashtag or something we should be promoting? I don't really understand how these things work.
Us neither.
We'll post it all on social media afterwards.
Yeah.
Whatever.
You don't have a social media platform yourself that you want to plug? Like, are you most active on Twitter, LinkedIn? Where can people find you?
Oh, there you go. See, that's good. So Twitter. I think it's at Prof Paul Dolan. That's where people can find me on Twitter. Brilliant. Thank you for allowing me to do more marketing. That comes a bit less naturally than selling the books.
Well, it's all good. It's all good. Thank you so much, Paul.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time.
Amazing. So that was us talking to the absolutely great Paul Dolan, who is incredibly good at giving very well-versed answers. So I'm very excited because Sarah can edit this, and I don't think she'll have to do much editing. So thank you, Paul. Besides not having to do much editing, Sarah, what else did you learn from today's episode?
Yeah, I do appreciate that. So I think there were three really nice, clear takeaways, at least for me. So I'm a person that's decided that I'm going to take something away from this. Now, you could choose to take nothing away from it as well, as Paul said. I love that.
Great great way to end. Anything they should take away from this? No. Okay.
Well, no, it's not. But I think this leads into the first point pretty nicely, and that's about adversarial collaboration. So actively collaborating with people that disagree with you, is going to produce better science, both for us as researchers in terms of what we can learn, and also for the people who are going to be affected by the science, so interventions, when you come up with interventions, go into a room with people who are bringing in different perspectives, different trainings, and different biases. So I think it's about leaving that notion at the door that, as Paul said, that scientists are all unbiased and level-headed and independent of the world that they operate in. It's obviously not true, but we still like to think of ourselves as such. Sure. So that was one. The second one was about considering all the science. So, I think this is particularly related to, I guess, the UK's response to coronavirus in my mind, where the thing that we've heard a lot is that the UK government have been following the science, right? Everything that they do, they've listened to scientists, and they're only going to do things that they can confirm that science would say is beneficial. But if you're only listening to medical professionals who are experts in epidemiology, or you're only listening to economists who, as Paul said, are sort of trained to think in terms of opportunity costs, you're not listening to all the science, right? And so interesting perspectives are not going to be heard, and we're going to end up in a world where certain things have emphasis and certain things do not, no matter how much of importance that these different aspects will eventually have in people's lives and on their well-being. And the third thing, I feel like I'm making a bit of a speech here, but the third thing, and I think the thing,
good. You've paid proper attention. I'm sitting in awe.
Okay, yeah, I do like, I'm a bit of a note taker, so I'm coming into my own here. But the third thing is something that, even in my own research, I come across this idea that if something is subjective, that it is pretty much impossible or extremely difficult to measure conceptually, and so we shouldn't really bother wasting resources trying to measure it, especially if we could focus instead on objective things, right? The benefits of objectively measured outcomes are that, if you agree that the measurement instrument or the data isn't necessarily biased, we can just trust it and, create causal influences and such. But, what Paul said about, the fact that happiness is subjective, but that doesn't necessarily pose a problem in the way that we like to think it does. Sure. And actually, the subjectivity of it all is reality, right? And that actually we should be trying to tap into people's experiences and even just acknowledge that experiences are heterogeneous. So really, operating in a world of averages does happiness a disservice. Is something little nugget of information that I think is going to stay with me, I think, a little bit after this is all said and done.
All right.
Yeah. Merle, to you. Here's the baton.
Here's the baton. Was there anything else to learn from this episode? First of all, I'd like to commend Sarah on the fact that she's able to summarize very well. I'm sure that helped you out a lot in education, Sarah, when studying for exams. I think that the last thing that you mentioned, that I think it's a good idea to get away from averages. I'm happy that Paul has leaned into that as well, and that sometimes what we're measuring is subjective, and there is only value in measuring the subjective side of it, which is something that a lot of science is like, no, it needs to be objective, it needs to be generalizable, it needs to be this, it needs to be that. And I think it's interesting to see a deviation from that, and I think it's a positive deviation in my humble opinion. Another thing I'm really keen about is, following from that same thought, is that it might be a good time to get a bit further away from prescription, where I've there are obviously things that are gonna make people happier. Like you're gonna be happier if you're in good health, but only given the fact that you know bad health. There's a lot of context surrounding that as well. But I think it's good to stop telling people constantly what they should be doing according to some type of ideal, because I think a lot of research has shown that this backfires as well. So to get away from prescription, to look more into the individual, to get away from averages, to get into the subjective experience. Like if someone really fucking hates exercise, but the research says exercise makes you happier, it's you tell me that when I'm crying on a treadmill, or
Yeah, exactly.
or as Paul really interestingly mentioned, like mindfulness is good for you. It makes me so depressed. It makes me so anxious, which is exactly the type of state you're trying to get away from. So I think it's really interesting that he mentioned things like this, because I fucking hate mindfulness. Absolutely hate it. I've got a couple of my friends, so so this is the actual the funny thing with it is that the two friends I've got in mind. So one has got ADHD and the other is clinically borderline. They also hate mindfulness. So I'm not entirely sure, like maybe you need to be like a healthy individual to benefit from mindfulness, but then what the fuck's the point?
Well,
like if it's only helping non-clinical people, like there's not many left of us,
Oh, well, yes. I mean, that all depends on whether or not you've been able to get a diagnosis.
True.
But I think that this is a really key pivot that Paul was talking about, that rather than just saying exercise is good for you, you say, well, exercising regularly is good for some people.
Yeah.
It is not going to work for everyone.
With regards to happiness, by the way, not with regards to losing weight, should probably work if you're trying to lose weight.
but for some people, exercise is actually painful if you've got arthritis.
Oh yeah. Don't do
it. There may be some cases where actually if the goal is to lose weight, there are other ways in which you could do that, mainly focusing on diet, or so it's about tailoring interventions, but also about not assuming that what we think of as the person developing the intervention, what we think of as good for other people is always going to be the case. It's that libertarian paternalism coming into play, but there is an element of paternalism to it, right? That's the idea that the policymaker or the person in charge of developing an intervention that pushes people towards a certain outcome is making an assumption that that certain outcome is going to boost people's, I don't know, you could argue happiness, well-being, or help them meet a certain goal that you think that they should be meeting. It could be completely unrelated to happiness. Sure. But I think we do need to think a little bit more about the responsibility that we have as behavioral scientists, and actually taking more into account welfare effects of the type of work that we're doing, because it is really important.
Yeah.
It's not easy.
No.
That's for sure, but it doesn't mean it's any less important.
No, absolutely. No, I think Paul shed light on a bunch of really interesting things. For example, that I never thought about the happiness of, for example, homeless people, which of course would have to be measured.
What a statement!
Yeah, I'm sorry to put it like it's. I put it really stupidly, but you know how I mean it. But like in the research capacity, I've never really considered it. And that how you would approach this, that there is a lack of data on it, and how you would change their happiness, what is happiness to them, which of course, I mean, it's not just the homeless versus, the people that do have a roof above their head, but it can be all different types of groups of people, social groups of people, that we just don't really think about as much as we should. And then, if we crank up like a nice generalizable, predominantly correlational based formula for happiness, that surprise it might not work for everyone. So no, I think this was a really good episode. I'm really happy with this. It's very, I feel like we've gone critical, like we engaged in quite a lot of critical thinking in this one, which is good for both Sarah and I, because we knew fuck all about the topic. So yay.
Yeah. No, I think we need to be a bit more adversarial with each other, Merle. Maybe I feel like I agree with you too much, and I don't think it's good for you.
Well, okay, I see how it is. Here. Well, clearly Sarah is trying to start beef with me. So I feel like we should end the episode here. Guys, I think I speak for both Sarah and I if I say, for us, this episode was super educational. I hope it was for you as well. If you have any more thoughts on the behavioral science of happiness or happiness studies in general, please sound off on the socials. And we hope you have a nice week, and hopefully until the next one.
You're the dummy that don't believe in science. All your projects always be denying. You're